Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Good morning, Ashley Bro.
Good morning, Scott Osborne. How are you today?
I'm excellent. I'm actually in upstate New York as we tape this. Whole different place.
Nice. And weather, is it less humid maybe than our 300% humidity that it feels like?
A little less, but I think that's just the state of summer. Everybody says, "Oh, here's some Florida weather for you," and I just sort of nod and say, "Yes, yes, Florida weather. I know."
I know. So I am excited about our topic today, but before we get on to our topic, do you want to do a little recap of our great conversation?
Because I think it connects. Last time we talked about the League of Women Voters, which still exists and still does amazing work, and all about their role as a nonpartisan advocate for voter education and voter rights. And I think that's going to connect also with your Women's Equity Day on August 26th, which is still coming up, correct?
Yes, who you were one of the panelists, and what I'm really liking the Women's Resource Center is doing this in collaboration with the League of Women Voters, is that we're acknowledging and celebrating the work that was done, but also really focusing on so many gaps, whether it's the wage gap, asset gap, opportunities for equity, and what are some of the things that are the root cause, and how can we look at shifting that narrative? So I think it's going to be great. And even though we are currently at capacity, if people are interested in, they can sign up and they'll get a recording because we're going to be recording it, which will be great.
Right. And hopefully it will make people more aware of some of the inequities that still exist, because some people don't know. But one little piece of trivia, the area where I'm currently in upstate New York is the part where there was a lot of very early American history and a lot of suffragette history. And one of Susan B. Anthony's homes where she lived for a while is right where I drive by to go to my quote unquote local gym, which is 20 miles away. But we drive past one. There's a little plaque outside the Susan B. Anthony house, so it's kind of fun.
Nice. Yeah, there was lots of work in upstate New York, Rochester,
Oh,
that.
the Seneca Falls Convention. I'm actually further east, but still, upstate New York was the hub for a lot of this for a number of reasons. That's another topic.
Another topic. I know. And so, what exciting things are we going to talk about today? What's in store?
We are going to talk about a good one that connects to League of Women Voters, but why don't more women get elected to political office in the United States? What's going on with that? What are some of the facts? What undergirds it, I would say, and what do we know? So, should we dive right in?
I think we should dive right in. I think it's an interesting topic, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Cool. We're going to talk about some of the what I call the social impediments to women being elected, as well as some very practical ones, some that are universal and some that are unique to the US. But first, let's get some facts that as we know, we've never had a female president in the
Mhm.
US. And we just recently had our first vice president, but never had a president elected. We have currently 50 states and 13 governors. So not even half. We're pretty much frozen at that. It's an accomplishment, but still needs work for equity.
Mhm.
And our elected legislative bodies, that's state legislatures, Congress, Senate, we average out pretty much around a third or a little bit below a third. Almost all of them, there's something about that third, 30%, maybe 28, 29%. We just can't seem to crack that with any consistency. So
Right. And it's not just this, Scott. Again, it's that the consistent thread.
yeah.
I know. So
And
anyway.
it's not that everything, obviously, of course, has to be 50-50. There's so many reasons why particular candidates are elected. There's many men who are very concerned about women's rights, etc. I'm not saying it has to be exactly, but we do have an issue if we think there's not enough representation of women. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I will say one thing that's sort of interesting is that many people, according to polls, are okay with the concept of voting for a woman in concept, abstractly, but then there's all these reasons why they don't vote for women. But let me also just put in one other statistic, which is telling, is the US is 53rd in the nation in terms of gender equity in politics. including far below many of our peers in terms of democracy, in terms of economics. So 53rd in the nation is not really much to crow. 53rd in the world, excuse me.
In the world, yeah, I was going to say that.
There's not much to crow about. So that's where we are from a global perspective.
Which is, I just think it's telling. That's a telling for all of the advancements and all of the things that we can say, from innovations to technology to the fact that we're 53rd in female representation is just, it's sad. It's sad to me. I don't know how, I can't come up with a different word other than disappointing. I could go with that too. And there's
Well, I
some,
will say
no, go ahead.
put it in historical context, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but these systems have been around for a very, very, very long time. So some of just women's right to vote is what, 100 years, only a little over 100 years,
Right.
perhaps. So some of these changes are a blink of an eye in terms of human history, but that's a separate topic. So it is progressing. Let's talk a little bit about social norms, because one of the first things is why this happens is social norms. Now, again, I will say, caveat, we of course don't know exactly how an individual votes. That is private in America, but there's all kinds of data that supports what these social norms are. And one of the big issues is what's called leadership coding. And this means, how do people see a leader when we elect people for office, especially executive offices like president or governor? We envision a leader, and there's all kinds of fascinating social data about what people see and hear and think. I'll tell you some of the things that people look for in a leader, and this is men and women. What do you want in a leader? They look for things like dominance. Does someone speak more loudly in a room? Are they assertive? Are they firm, quick decision makers? Are they taller? Do they seem competitive? So think about this kind of category of what we are all coded for. It's sort of an implicit bias. That's who we see as a leader, and that's fairly American. Now, many of those things you might argue are not the most leaderly qualities. When they survey people in workplaces, homes, other settings, organizations, they really say they want leaders who listen well, take other people's opinions, know how and when to delegate, can handle group dynamics. Those are the kind of things people say in other settings. But when it comes to election, that's what we see. And that's a very, very masculine coded image, something like taller, something like dynamic, dominant behavior. So we seem to have this implicit bias built in for male kinds of behaviors, the things that men are socialized to be as who we see as a leader. We don't see someone who is collaborative or who listens well, who might sit back in a meeting and take in other people's opinions. We don't code that as leaders when we go to the ballot box. So that's a tough one right there. I would say that there's a special challenge for women in the US presidency, and this is related, is because the US is a very militaristic nation in many ways. Our military and our dominant role in the globe, we're a nuclear power, etc., is very significant to our sense of identity. And people code a military leader with very traditional male-oriented kinds of strength qualities. So it's very tough for a woman to project that, as long as that's how we see that requirement of military prowess kind of thing.
Well, and then even if we look at the backlash of, and we'll probably talk about this a bit later, but it's just in my brain. If a woman is exerting dominance or being loud or being authoritative, it's not always seen in the same positive light as if it were a man exhibiting those same attributes,
Exactly.
right? So it's kind of a double-edged sword there.
We like our candidates, when it comes to voting, we like our candidates to stand in specific gender boxes. We like the men to be masculine and tall and these kind of things. And we don't want women stepping outside what we see as a kind of stereotypical gendered female box. Interestingly, it shows through polls that voters also prefer candidates who stick to issues that seem to be sort of gendered coded. If we have a woman running for office we prefer her if she talks about things like healthcare and childcare and education and what might be called traditional female roles. We can sort of
Mm-hmm.
see that it fits with our understanding. And men can talk about national security and economics and taxes and things that we code as more masculine purview. Again, there's nothing in our real qualifications that show this. There's nothing that says men are better at economics. There's nothing that
Right.
says that men are necessarily better at that. And there's nothing that says that women are necessarily better at healthcare policy. But we see that as fitting within traditional gender boxes. So that affects people when they get to the polling booth. I'll say one other thing on the social norms is the media plays into this very much. Something like appearance. Candidates who are female are far more likely to be commented on by their appearance, judged
Mm-hmm.
by their appearance. What is she wearing? What does her hair look like? And another basket of sort of family roles. Well, how is she managing her family? Does this make, where are your kids? What do you bake? That sort of thing. So we in the media tend to then amplify that by asking about traditional female things. People do not comment the same way on men's appearance. So it
Mm-hmm.
reinforces people's mind appearance for women candidates. So that's a thing in terms of our social norms that we're seeing. Do we want candidates who lean into their gendered roles, as it's called?
Yeah. Well, and so two things that kind of come to mind on this is one, just how absolutely critical socialization is to our thought process and our biases. Just, I mean, from the very beginning. And I know that you talk about this all the time, and it's a big piece of what you do, but it's just an underlying part of our society that if we don't recognize and question, how are we going to shift it?
Mm. And it's interesting. This is not biology. This is not estrogen and testosterone. This is the way we
Right.
get through socialization
Hmm.
that we think women have expertise in some areas and men have expertise in other areas, and they should stick with that. So, and again, much of this is what's called implicit biases. It's not on the table. There is a certain percentage of people who say they would never vote for a woman, for example. You might
Hmm.
call that discrimination. That's their preference. Those percentages are small, but they're there. But
Hmm.
for more people, it's implicit. They really don't even realize it. It just taps into the way they've always seen these genders, the way they want these norms to act and look and behave. A taller candidate. I mean, why would a taller candidate have, male or female, have any of these kind of qualities that are important in a president or an elected leader? Presumably, it doesn't have a lot to do with height.
Hmm.
And people know that intellectually, but they're biased. And this is men and women. Women want the taller candidate too. So,
Right.
that kind of stuff. It almost feels a little laughable. We're not in an era where physical prowess was really the thing that you needed in elected office. You need
Hmm.
something else. But we hark back to that kind of physical role. So that helps.
Well, and I think it is
So
important to note it's not just men. I mean, women have these same biases of, and I've heard many women like, oh, I just don't know if I could vote for a woman, which seems completely antithetical to me. But it's interesting because that's just, we've been socialized to say this is a leader. It's the John F. Kennedy, the Ronald Reagan, the Jimmy Carter, who fill in the blank of all male.
And it's interesting that polls show that about 10% of women do say, this is women, they could not vote for a woman. That's just, woman president. Sorry, woman president. And about
Hmm.
20% of Republican women feel that way. So that's not nothing. And that's
Hmm.
overt. No, I just couldn't do it, they'll say. Now, again, when the time comes, we know people vote for candidates not just based upon their gender, of course. There's many other factors, but that is something that has shown up in polling. So we do know that. Let's talk a little bit though, but there are some other what we call practical or social impediments to women
Hmm.
being elected. One of them is that historically, the pipeline professions for political office were overwhelmingly male. Things like business, prominent business person,
Hmm.
law, the military. These created not only these kind of trappings of professionalism that people want to see, but also the networks. In America, it's phenomenally expensive to be elected. These give people the networks. That's changing some,
To raise
but
money, to be
to
clear.
raise money. Thank
Right.
you. Raise money. Thank you. And so all these traditional pipeline professions were historically male, and they're still dominated by men. Obviously, there are women in law, there are women in business, of course, there are some women in the military, but the majority of all the powerful positions in those professions are still male. So these are our pipelines. So, that's an issue. That takes some time. There's no question that there's an incumbency advantage. This is because of the American system and how way districts are created and moved around, and just simple name recognition. We don't have a
Mhm.
parliamentary system where you vote in a party. We vote for individuals. So that creates a real stickiness to a candidate. So if a man gets in there, which they have historically done, it's real hard to get them out. There aren't that many really competitive races below the president in any given election, which is interesting.
Well, and coming from the Southeast and the South Carolina, um, we had Strom Thurmond who, they would wheel in
Of
to
course.
like to vote. And it was just like, oh my, yeah, there's really like there
Yes.
needs to be that's trending across, like getting people to step back from that
Yeah.
role is really hard. So not only the incumbency, but probably giving up the power of being a senator or a congressman or what, fill in the blank. So yeah.
And that cuts across party lines. You
Hmm.
get in there, man, it's much easier to stay. There's no question. That's a feature of the US system. It's
Yes.
interesting, though, too. One of the impediments that many people see is the lifestyle, the political lifestyle. I mean, yes, there's perks and there's benefits, but certainly running for office and the time expectations, those are very unfamily friendly. And we talk about the care burden a lot.
Hmm.
Women are still overwhelmingly responsible for families up and down, parents, grandparents, children, etc. And it's very unforgiving just as a lifestyle. So you can easily see why many women would simply opt out or not be able to stay in as long. It's
Hmm.
very hard, and most women still, as we've said, are responsible for a lot of care and unpaid care, and that's a tough one for them.
Either that, or as we were kind of doing the prep for this, women are running for office at, as they age because, maybe the kids are out of the house, those caregiving responsibilities have lessened. So, maybe they're starting their first run in their 50s, late 50s versus
Exactly.
their 30s.
We see
Um,
that up and down.
hmm. Which is an interesting thing. We're going to have a link that we share in the notes of this, but can we talk a little bit about the pragmatic bias? I thought that it was just such an interesting article to read.
Sure. So we talked about how social norms sort of affect people when they get into the ballot box, and then there's some practical impediments that help keep women's numbers down. But the so-called pragmatic bias becomes a vicious circle, is because we tend to have fewer women elected. We don't see them, we're not used to them. We, by we I will mean all of us in general, tend to think they are less electable, and we don't want to throw away our votes. That's a big thing. So, pragmatically, people will say, yeah, I like her, I agree with her policies, but she probably won't get elected. So, I'm going to go in this other direction. We see that in things like primary elections because
Mhm.
of our primary system for president. We see it in local races too. It appears in polls show this pragmatic based bias, and that's across party lines as well. So the people will, in a way, handicap themselves. It's not like she's not going to win. They'll say it's unlikely. So that's a so-called pragmatic voting. People want to use their vote where it's going to make a difference. And because women don't get elected as often, people don't
Mhm.
see it as being normalized.
Yeah, and even people who are, as you said, might like that candidate better. It's just the thought of like, well, it's probably really not going to happen, so let's not do
Yeah.
that. So I just thought the data on that was just really interesting, not looking at any other factors than electability of, it may not happen, so I'm not going to do it. Um, I think too, how candidates are spoken about, whether it's in media or with people having discussions. And I think that definitely masculine versus feminine on not only appearance, but I want to dig a little deeper into the, I don't like the way she laughed was a big one in this last election, or they don't seem as smart as the other person. So I think it's interesting that is it maybe the level of scrutiny that women are held to versus men in the election process? Is that accurate?
Well, it tends to be what we call more gender coded criticisms or slurs or attacks. So if, maybe your economic policies are just as good as, let's say, the man she's running against, but
Mhm.
those attacks are more likely to be what you see is really sort of personal, gender coded things, therefore highlighting the notion of this is a woman, right? So something that's trivial, how someone's voice sounds. We don't, presumably for men and women, is not a super important thing in terms of many political offices. But picking up on those, and it subtly triggers this implicit bias, is what it's doing. I mean, candidates aren't foolish, they have strategists. So it subtly says to voters, oh, she's stepping outside that gendered box. And voters like people to stay in their gendered box at the moment. So that's kind of what it subtly says. I will say that this works for men and women. I mean, both sides, it's terrible. There are many historical examples of men attacking other male competitive candidates, their competitors in primaries, are using slurs that attack their gender. In other words, they feminize them, So there was
Oh,
an
yeah.
example of Bush Kerry, whatever year Bush Kerry was, that Kerry, the Democrat, was allegedly this sort of Frenchified sissy. They were basically saying he's not masculine enough. In the primaries, with Trump and Rubio, Lanny media commentators picked up on the fact that Rubio wore, I think it was cowboy boots with heels or something, or shoes that had a larger heel, basically triggering this subtle implicit that they're sort of feminized. So men will use it against another man because if you have feminine qualities, that's a slur, and it triggers this kind of gender thing. For women also, Sarah Palin was attacked by some media commentators, media, etc., as a bimbo, a very female oriented, meaning she's not really intelligent, she might have
Hmm.
looks, but not intelligent. So, um, you will be attacked on those kind of gendered norms and gendered slurs very often. It's sad because it shouldn't have anything to do with political electability or political qualifications, I should say.
Right. And I remember with Marco Rubio, it was the little Marco.
Yes,
That was so, I mean,
Marco.
like, and I mean, it was literally size of,
Yes.
right? I'd forgotten about that.
Blatant and tall. We've said taller. Taller is important. Taller evokes masculine power and leadership. So somebody instantly, as soon as you say little, little, little. So men will use
Right.
this kind of gendered slurs on one another.
Um, and I just think that that's interesting. And it's part of what we have talked about too is getting out of the gender roles of what is the job of a woman, a wife, you know, you should be taken care of or being on the home front and not out and
They're
trying
very
to.
traditional,
Yes.
stereotypical roles for women,
Mhm.
exactly. And there's another one that this is, and the thinking is that this is especially affecting the possibility of a woman being elected US president,
Mhm.
is what we call the unsettled factor. And this is again true for men and women, our electorate at large, is the notion of who's in charge, whether it's a workplace or a home or something like that. Traditionally, many people have absorbed the notion that the man is in charge in some
Mhm.
way. And of course, in recent years, as women have become more educated, we are not frozen in those traditional roles. There may be more women who are the breadwinners of a home, or they may raise money equally. There are women who are bosses, who might be in charge of a team or a workplace or a company. So we have shifted some, but many people have tapped into the idea that the notion of a female president, US president,
Mhm.
arguably that's the most important position on the planet, or certainly one of the top ones. If a woman is in charge there, that's very deeply unsettling to many people. And I would say women and men. This is what they pick up in polls just because it's so different. And if a woman could be, quote unquote, in charge of the most important position, what does that say about all of our roles and norms of who's in charge, who's really got the leadership roles, who we look to figure things out? And in many ways, I would say I'm very empathetic with this one. And then I think, of course, a woman could be qualified and could do it just as well.
Mhm.
But I empathize with people's long held expectations. I think we have to be honest about that. If people sort of subtly want someone they see as incompetent in charge and that codes as male, it's very tough for them to see a woman in that position. So I think that's really probably will take some thought and people being honest with themselves about that. It's very deeply unsettling to many, many people for very implicit reasons. Give you something.
Well, and I think giving the space to, and we'll continue to talk about this in other podcasts, but it's so easy to think of the worst reasons why things don't happen or to, assume the worst intent of why you didn't vote for a female or and the reality is a lot of it is truly part and parcel of how we've been socialized and being aware of it and starting to recognize and make those shifts. So it's not always this intentional thing. So giving that space for conversation sometimes that's more productive conversation rather than always going to the worst possible
Yeah.
space.
I agree, and I would say because I know we're almost out of time, but it's also too, we don't have to push people into it. I think it's important to say to people, well, what do we want? We want the best talent. We want this is good for all of us, you know. It doesn't help any of us to keep people frozen in these boxes. There we know many men who are phenomenal caregivers. We want
Mhm.
them to be fathers, etc.
Right.
So it's really, I would say it's good for all of us to think a little more broadly and not push ourselves into these gendered roles. We don't have to force people, just say, hey, is this really working out for us? Is there another way that it might work better?
Right.
Time, Ashley. I think we're
I
pretty good.
know.
All
Great
right.
conversation. So make sure to check out show notes. There's like we said, links to some good content and more research, and look forward to our next conversation.
We continue. Thank you.
I know. Thank you.
Take
See
care.
you soon.